I'd like to welcome you to Module 3 of EDU510. As you'll see in this module, we're going to be rather busy. First of all, the readings are complex and there's lots of resources that you may want to take advantage of, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But first, let's look at some of the assignments that are coming up in this module. First of all, you'll be doing your usual reflection forum. However, due to the fact that this is such a busy module, there's no requirement that you respond to the other people in your group. So you will be responsible for doing, you'll be responsible for doing your initial response as usual, and that's due February the 12th. However, there's no responsibility after that for you to respond to any of your colleagues. And as I've mentioned, it's because you're going to be busy with other things, so this will give you a little bit of extra time for that. The second assignment that you'll be handing in on February the 19th at the end of this module is the first set of the article critiques, of which you'll have several by the end. I believe it's 12. So in set 1, you're going to look at 5 articles. Only one of those articles may be from a professional journal. And if you're wondering whether an article is a professional journal or an academic journal, you can go into the library settings, and when you do your searches, you can actually find out whether it's what kind of a journal it is. I'll perhaps do a little video of that just to show you where that shows up. However, that's kind of a handy feature, and it will give you an opportunity to make the differentiation between the two. But you're only allowed one professional journal. You don't have to have any at all, but because often we're more familiar with those, you may wish to include one, and sometimes they have the kind of more practical information that you may want to include in your project. And speaking of your projects, of course, at this point, you'll be wanting to start having a look, more than start, you'll be having a look at the kind of literature that exists in relation to the topic that you are thinking about doing your project about. So this assignment is an excellent opportunity for you to have a look at the literature that exists, to interact with it a little bit, get a feeling of whether this is going to be helpful to you or not, and then provide you with the beginnings of what you will need for your literature review for your project. So in this first set, you'll be doing 5 articles, as I've already mentioned, most of which will be from academic journals. In order to set it up, you'll need to include a full reference for each article using APA 6th edition formatting. This again is a resource that you can continue to use because you can cut and paste it from into various articles that you might be writing, papers that you might be writing, or indeed your project. So it becomes a resource, and so it's worth spending the time doing that part correctly. After you've done your reference, you will create an annotated bibliography for the 5 articles you've chosen. So under each reference, you're going to include a brief summary of the key concepts in the article, only 3 or 4 sentences, and the relevance of that article to your topic or topics of interest, and that will be 1 or 2 sentences. So again, this will act as a resource. It will be an assignment, but it will continue to be a resource that you'll be able to use on a continuing basis throughout the process of doing your project. So this is a very practical assignment, as well as a somewhat time-consuming assignment. So I'll put that out there so that you can organize your time accordingly. The whole set that you'll be handing in will be a maximum of 5 pages double-spaced. That, of course, doesn't include your cover page, but the actual assignment itself should be a maximum of no more than 5 pages. Your items will be double-spaced. You'll use Times Roman 12 because it's a font that's easy to read, and that size is also easy to read. And you'll use 1-inch margins on your page. If you want further information about this article, you can look in the syllabus and check out further information, including a template, an example of the articles at the critique link. Okay, so so if you have, certainly again, if you have any questions about the assignments, please get in touch with me, and I'll be happy to talk to you about them. And if there are questions that keep coming up, of course, I'll post an email on announcements to everyone so that you can have a look at some of the questions that are coming up that probably are similar to those that you might have yourself. Okay, so as I've mentioned, this is going to be a busy module, partly because the concepts that we're going to be engaging with are very complex, but they're at the heart of the kinds of things that you're going to be needing to grapple with in your own work and in your project. And to begin that process of looking at concepts like paradigms, epistemology, ontology, methodology, all of these sorts of terms that are often thrown around in research articles, and you may still be grappling with the meaning of those words. This module is meant for you to be a space for you to do just that, grapple with these ideas. And in order to do that, you're going to be reading, and you'll need to set aside time for this reading, because this is not TV reading. This is not sitting out in your deck reading, although it's probably too cold to do that anyway. This is, get into a quiet room and without interruption kind of reading, because as I mentioned, the concepts are complex, and Lincoln and Guba and Lincoln in this article explore some complex and yet necessary ideas that researchers need to have an awareness of and be able to speak to. But we're not leaving you on your own to kind of sort through these ideas. There are a couple of short videos by Ian Robertson that are also linked in the module. I believe they're linked under the tab setting under readings. So if you go to that, you'll see two videos by Ian Robertson. And what he does is do a kind of very abbreviated and simplified, in a sense, exploration of some of the ideas that Lincoln and Guba go into in much greater detail. So they're well worth spending some time on. I think a total they'll take you about 10 minutes. There's also an article by Anne Ryan that's listed in the on the e-class. And it also is a very good article to kind of work your way through this notion of positivism and post-positivism that Guba and Lincoln talk about in their article. And in her article, she lays it out again in a more reader-friendly format. It's equally complex in many ways, but she provides information, I think, in a way that's probably more digestible, shall we say. So you might want to kind of spend some time on those resources. Watch my video that kind of lays out the foundational ideas from Guba and Lincoln, and then go into Guba and Lincoln itself. And I think you'll find that if you do that, you don't have to do all of those steps, but those that are going to be helpful to you. You're required to do my video, and you're required to do the readings, of course, but the others, if you have time to do those as well, they will really assist you in reading this article. So now that I've talked about Lincoln and Guba in this way, who are they? First of all, they're a married couple, although Egan Guba died several years ago. Ivana Lincoln continues to work and continues to write, and it continues to do a great deal of work with Norman Denzin. So you'll sometimes see in some of the research articles written by Lincoln and Denzin, or Denzin and Lincoln. So she has continued to work in the area of research methodologies, and particularly post-positivist methodologies in education research. And so these are two prolific and highly respected authors in the area of educational research. You will see their names cited often. And so I know it's not perhaps an easy entry into some of these ideas, but they were among the first to bring these ideas from other areas of research, other academic disciplinary areas of research into education, and find connections to the kinds of questions that educators were seeking a way to wrestle with and didn't have the tools. And Lincoln and Guba have provided that. So I would strongly urge you to set aside the time to really spend some time with these readings and really kind of get them deep-seated in your understanding so that you could bring that understanding to your own work in your educational research. In the article, we're going to be looking at particular kinds of terminology. And I'm in particular concerned with three kinds of terminology that you may have encountered in other courses, but I just wanted to be sure that we were on the same page around these particular concepts. The first is ontology. And ontology, I should preface this by saying that all three, if you looked for articles and books, could fill a whole library. So I'm not doing them a huge service by looking at them so briefly, but hopefully this will be helpful. Ontology is really around the nature of being, what things are, what is the essence of the thing itself. And when you're considering that, for example, when you're looking at what is the essence of a table, what is the nature of being a table, what is the nature of being a chair, a book, etc. What is the essence of the thing itself? That is, you're looking at the ontology of what is. And so it's, in a way, it's identifying or enabling you then to differentiate a table from a chair, for example. When you get into concepts that are more esoteric, like love or equity or teaching, etc., it becomes much more complex. So when we're looking at this, sorry about that. I have this pop-up that keeps coming up. It drives me crazy. Anyway, when you're looking at these concepts, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about ontology. Epistemology is the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief from opinion. Some of you in your observations, for example, you might have noticed me making a little comment about, can you really make this conclusion based on the evidence that you provided? And you might have thought that I was being extra picky, and I don't know, maybe I was, but I just wanted you to start thinking about how we oftentimes do not differentiate between justified belief and opinion. And of course, epistemology is the study of what justifies that belief. How is it that we can know what we think we know? How can we distinguish these kinds of justifications for the kinds of conclusions that we come to in the research that we do? Methodology, and these follow on one another in very important ways. Methodology then is the systematic theoretical analysis of the methods applied to a field of study. It comprises the theoretical analysis of the body of methods and principles associated with a branch of knowledge. So we're not talking about methods. We're not talking about what we actually do. That is, we use a survey or we use interviews, etc. But how is it that we can theoretically analyze the methods that we use, and how is it that they attach to our epistemology and ontology? So these three areas are of primary consideration when we're thinking about research and the kind of research that we do. The last term that we're using is actually perhaps should have been the first, in that it's the overarching concept over ontology, epistemology, and methodology. And Guba and Lincoln talk about that in their article. It's a distinct, what is a paradigm then? It's a distinct set of concepts or thought patterns. And that distinct set of thought patterns and concepts constitutes a basic belief system or worldview. We all operate
whether we can articulate it or not, we all operate within a basic belief system or worldview. And that basic belief system or worldview guides us in the decisions that we make as an investigator, in the choices of method that we use, and more importantly, perhaps, since they overarch the methods, the ontology and epistemology that informs how we interrogate the world in fundamental ways. Paradigm encompasses theories, research methods, postulates, and standards for what constitutes legitimate contributions to a field. So in the field of educational administration, in the field of curriculum studies and so on, there are particular ways in which, for example, when I submit an article, my fellow academics make a decision about whether that article meets the standards of that field in terms of the research that I've done. And they may send it back to me and say, you haven't considered this, you haven't considered that, and I need to do that before I can resubmit that article. Thomas Kuhn talks about this. He's talking particularly about the field of the one might call the hard sciences, but he's looking in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, 1962, which I think is telling because, of course, the 60s and the 70s were a time of great questioning of what existed and a lot of social revolution. So it's not surprising, really, that someone would be considering how it is that these paradigmatic shifts that were happening all around us in that period of time, how that was happening. And he introduced the notion of paradigm shift, and you'll often hear this phrase used, often incorrectly, because they're really not talking about paradigms at all. But nevertheless, it has been taken up in common usage. But what he's talking about is the kind of a paradigm that we've discussed and that Lincoln and Guba discuss as well. And he argues that paradigm shifts don't happen in a linear or continuous way. It isn't, one day we're doing quantitative research and the next day we're doing qualitative, or it's kind of a smooth transition from one to the other. It's often raucous, it's often dramatic, it's often melodramatic. It's not smooth and continuous. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute. Because as you open up new ways of thinking about phenomena, then that validity of those new ways then is questioned. And so, I submit an article using qualitative methodology and the dominant paradigm is quantitative. How is it that my work will be judged by my peers? How will it be seen as valid? Will it be accepted or rejected? And over time, as this conversation continues in lively and very spirited ways sometimes, slowly things will be accepted, and some will continue to reject. But over time, a consensus begins to build that this particular kind of research is okay. So, for example, hermeneutic phenomenological research interpretivist research in educational administration began to be accepted. I wouldn't have had nearly the problems that I had when I did my work several years ago within the academic community. So these competing paradigms then can be seen as incommensurable. And so this creates tension. And in many ways they are, as Lincoln and Guba suggest in their article, there's real difficulty bridging that gap between positivism, post-positivism, and critical and interpretivist. That chasm is very, very wide. But there are those who argue, and argue quite eloquently, that you can use them to inform one another, but as paradigms, they are incommensurable. So I'll give you an example of Tom Greenfield. Tom Greenfield is a scholar who actually did his PhD at the U of A. At the time, he became an expert in doing quantitative research. He was well known in the field of quantitative research, used often as a consultant. He became well known in his field. His writing was in this area. When he went to the U of T, he continued with this work, and then he had a sabbatical. He went to Europe He studied European philosophy. Apparently that was an interest of his that he had developed. And he came across what broadly is called interpretivism. The Romantic philosophers they're sometimes referred to. And when he thought about what he was learning in relation to his field of study, he began to see that one could think very differently. One could move into a different paradigm. One could shift paradigms in thinking about the field of educational administration. And so he began to think about and write about this field in this particular way. He gave his first paper in I believe it was 1979. I could be wrong about that. But he gave it in Bristol in England at a large conference that was attended as well by Daniel Griffiths, a well-known quantitative researcher in educational administration in the United States, highly influential. He attended Tom Greenfield's presentation, and it must have been compelling because it really called into question much of what Griffiths had been doing. And there was, to quote those who attended, a bit of a shouting match that occurred. It was a very, very lively discussion that occurred between these two scholars who came from different paradigmatic positions, both of them rather powerful. And so, although Griffiths was much more powerful, had a much wider audience in the United States, of course. So from that point on, you'll find it difficult, for example, to find books by Tom Greenfield because he couldn't get published. His articles were published in some journals. There were some collections of his papers that were published especially in Australia and the UK, interestingly enough, never in the US. There were very, very few scholars who took up his work, few. Most of them who were critical scholars who were starting to emerge in the US. And so this paradigm shift occurred actually right about the time it was starting to really take root at the time that I started my master's. And so you can begin to understand why the tensions were still there. So it's just an illustration of how deeply felt, how deeply seated these paradigmatic shifts are. All right, just to move along very quickly then, let's look quickly then at the kind of construct or skeleton of the Goubel and Lincoln article. They, of course, consider this paradigmatic shift from quantitative to qualitative. And they look at, and they argue that the quantitative paradigm was largely dominant and continues to be in many ways, whether in the physical or the human sciences or the social sciences, we might call them. And that continues to be the case. So, for example, a highly influential field of study in education would be psychology. And psychology still, to this day, is highly dominated by quantitative research. That's not to say that qualitative doesn't occur. Pardon me, I have a dry throat. It doesn't occur, but the dominant paradigm is quantitative. When the social sciences, the human sciences began to emerge in universities, in education, in sociology, etc., the quantitative paradigm was taken up because it was the dominant one in universities. And it, to some degree, provided some stature and acceptance within this academic community for these new fields of inquiry. But it did take a while, actually, for critiques to start to emerge, because one could argue that it's very different to establish the point at which water boils as compared to the point at which good teaching occurs. And so these are kind of incommensurable domains in some ways. That's not to say that they don't overlap to some degree, but those overlaps are few and far between. So internal critiques started to emerge. And those internal critiques were around the fact that research did not take into consideration context, and context is crucial in education. It excluded meaning and the meaning and purpose of education. And when we think, for example, of the Hostetler article talking about educational research should have meaning, it should make a difference. This disjunction of grand theories from local contexts, because the work needed to be generalizable to all contexts. quantitative work, that is. Qualitative work, on the other hand, offers the opportunity to look at the particular rather than the general. The inability or inapplicability of the general to the specific, and the exclusion of discovery. That with quantitative work, you start from what you know or what you think you know, and then you go on to prove it. Whereas in qualitative work, sometimes you don't know exactly what it is that you're going to find. You have no idea, really. So you introduce a general area or a general question. You kind of set a direction, but then something may emerge that you didn't expect at all that changes the research entirely. And so the critique was that quantitative work didn't offer that opportunity. The external critiques, Goob and Lincoln argue, were even more important. These are the more heavily philosophical critiques around the theory-ladenness of facts, the underdetermination of theory, that theory underdetermines context, for example, the value-ladenness of facts, that facts, when we take them up, as you found out when you were doing your observations, are attached to values. They're attached to our beliefs. They're attached to belief systems and worldviews. And people with different worldviews may look at the same set of facts and ask different questions of them or see different things within them. They also, one of the external critiques was the interactive nature of the inquirer and the inquired, and how they need to be thought of as intertextual rather than separate from one another. So both sets of critiques were influential, but the second set proved to be the tipping point for paradigmatic change. So the nature of paradigms and what do we know about them? And they conclude with this, and I'll talk about this in the next couple of slides. First of all, we have the ontological, epistemological, and methodological questions that attach to each of these positions. But they stress some caveats around the whole notion of paradigms. That is, that you can't prove within a shadow of a doubt that quantitative research is better than qualitative research. They come from different domains. So it's like comparing apples and oranges. So none are open to proof in any kind of conventional sense. Each represents the most informed and sophisticated view of its proponents. So over time, this is what we know about a particular kind of quantitative research. This is what we know about a particular kind of qualitative research. This is the most informed and sophisticated view of those who do that kind of work, and that becomes, in some senses, the standard by which it's judged. But all of these views are human constructions. They have been developed by academics and scholars over a period of time through trial and error, through review, etc. And all must rely on persuasiveness and utility rather than proof in arguing its position. So if you're arguing that you are going to be using quantitative research for a particular research study, then you need to be persuasive about why it is that you've chosen that method and what it's going to offer you that other methods cannot. And that's how you justify the kind of research methodology and methods that you use. So then they go on to take on positivism, post-positivism, critical theory et al. And I would argue, and I think others would argue, that postmodernism and post-structuralism are a different kettle of fish in some ways. But I think they are in many ways commensurable to critical theory, so I won't argue about that. Just to add that as a little note, that since they wrote this article, I am guessing that there might be some movement around that. And then the fourth category is constructivism, naturalism, which comes out of interpretivist tradition. So you'll sometimes hear it called constructivism, sometimes naturalism, sometimes interpretivism. They all have a slightly different meaning, but they're very, very close in their characteristics to one another. And in the rest of the paper, then, we talk about basic beliefs of received and alternative paradigms, an interparadigmatic kind of analysis between these four paradigms, a cross paradigm analysis, which is very interesting. And then finally, and I think in some ways most interestingly, the implications of each paradigm's position on selected practical issues. So they talk about what is the nature of knowledge. And of course, this has implications, right? Because the nature of knowledge for me comes out of my worldview. It comes out of my life experience. If someone has a different worldview, for example, there's been a lot of very interesting research around indigeneity and indigenous worldviews. And that has implications then for how it is that you construct your research. So how is a body of knowledge constructed then based on that body, the nature of that knowledge? And that has then implications for the kind of work that we can have a look at. When quantitative research was the dominant paradigm, that's what I had to read, even though it wasn't speaking to me and what I wanted to look at. Nevertheless, that was all I had to look at. So if we don't, if there isn't a paradigm that responds to the kinds of questions that we want to ask, that come out of our worldview and our experience of the world, then that has real implications then for scholars who come from different kinds of experiences and worldviews. What's the role of values? What's the place of ethics? What is the place of voice? And of course, that question has real implications for example, feminist research. It has significant implications for Indigenous research and so on. And then what about novice inquirers? And the tension that there might be between paradigms. Are paradigms in conflict? Well, I think this article suggests that they are, but there are others who say that there's a way for them to come together. Creswell would be one of them. And which is most influential? And of course, most would argue now, given this age of accountability, that quantitative research has gained some ascendancy after a period of time in which qualitative research really took on a space and place in educational research. So I'm sorry to have gone on to some length here, but I hope that these comments have been helpful to you and that you'll be able to use this in some kind of useful and meaningful way when you're reading Guba and Lincoln. And if you have any questions about any of this or the assignments, please feel free to get in touch with me. I welcome your inquiries.